Bien, buenas tardes. En primer lugar, muchas gracias.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here this afternoon. We know it's a bad time after lunch, but we have an interesting session for you. We're gonna talk about war experiences and childhood. Boys and girls, children are the most vulnerable and innocent group of people in wartime, and the one that's harmed the most because they see their life interrupted by conflicts that will have an impact on them for the rest of their lives. Outside the room, you can see an exhibition, and we can read a sentence that I think summarizes very well what's the situation of children during conflict. Is a sentence by the creator of Save the Children, and it says that all fair and unfair wars are wars against children. And I think she's right. And it's something that we can see currently. We're gonna watch a documentary by Laura López on this topic, on childhood. It's Childhood Without War, and Laura is gonna introduce the documentary. She teaches at the University Rey Juan Carlos. She specializes in cinema, historical context, propaganda in cinema, and photography. She has published on the topic. She's published Redes Transnacionales de Propaganda a Favor de la República, Guillermo Fernández Zúñiga y la producción cinematográfica, Spain in Exile. And related to childhood, she published recently Los niños en la propaganda cinematográfica humanitaria tras la Segunda Guerra Mundial, Semillas del Destino. So without further ado, we'll give the floor to Laura to talk about the documentary, and then we're going to see the documentary. We have Jesús, Alonso, and Sébastien Farré. After the documentary, they are going to make their presentation to deepen on the topic. So Laura, you've got the floor. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers of the conference for having invited me and for the warm welcome. I'm going to introduce briefly the documentary. As Matilde has said, it's called Infancias en Guerra, and it's part of the project Rememchild. We're going to see an excerpt of what's going to be an interactive documentary. Don't forget that will be available in the website of the project starting in November. So we've taken an excerpt of the documentary that focused on education, and we try to incorporate some of the questions we have taken into account when doing the documentary. We have been thinking about how to represent childhood during war times. There is an interesting debate about the representation and whether it's useful or not to use particularly aggressive images of what happens to children during wartime. And we had to consider also what sources we were going to use. And another thing has to do with the approach we take. Are children passive subjects, active subjects of their own story? Are they victims? The relationship between representation and memory, when we talk about children, since the end of the First World War, and particularly because there was a blockade in Central Europe, Save the Children did propaganda campaigns to show the suffering of children that were experiencing these blockade circumstances or situation. The success of those campaigns had the result that the seeing children as victims, the ones that were suffering, innocent victims, and this image was used later by governments. Since First World War, in the Spanish Civil War, for instance, Republicans and the others used the image of children as innocent victims for propaganda purposes. The Republican side showed the disaster that the fascists were provoking on children, and the government in Spain after the war used this image to legitimate itself with the message that children would be safe at that moment in Spain. There has been campaigns to show children as innocent victims of the war and show how vulnerable they were. So we consider that the sources we had, that are archives, are very often propaganda sources, very often created by governments and that have been used with propaganda purposes. So we had to look carefully at the sources if we wanted to use them. We thought it would be very interesting to take into account the declarations or the words of people who took part or suffered the conflict. And these testimonies, these witnesses, will be in the platform and in the final version of the documentary. When we were interviewing some of these people, these people re-elaborated their past, and they were telling us about moments that were relatively happy. During that time, they were with friends and cousins. Maybe they didn't know exactly what was happening, the war that was taking place, but it's been processed or experienced as a very painful moment. They were telling us about the hunger they were suffering. We have talked to historians that have studied the topic. And we saw that we've gone from this idea of the big battles to a more national and local point of view. However, sometimes it's difficult to relate all this. We have been thinking carefully about this idea of children as innocent victims, and children are obviously innocent, but we thought up to what point we could show all the childhoods in the same way or on an equal foot. What do I mean with this? Children on the one side and on the other, their suffering can be shown in the same way. Jordi tells us that if we do it, maybe we are dispossessing the contemporary history, but we're talking about children, so I will leave it hears, and maybe we can discuss about that later. And I hope you enjoy the documentary. Thank you, Laura. And now we're gonna watch the documentary.
Junto a la memoria auditiva y las representaciones auditivas tenemos el otro tipo de representaciones, las representaciones visuales. ¿Cuáles son las relaciones que se pueden establecer entre memoria y representaciones visuales? Ahí empiezan los conflictos porque hay quien dice que el horror no se puede representar porque la representación es dominar la realidad y por lo tanto estas representaciones del horror lo que hacen es quitar el aguijón de memoria que tiene ese sufrimiento del pasado y domesticar con la representación lo que pasó hace años. La representación es un dominio sobre lo real que nos ayuda a estar a gusto. Sin embargo, las representaciones en ese concepto de memoria política deberían mantener la tensión de no vamos a volver a repetir esto, que no haya un happy end.
La infancia se suele considerar como el periodo comprendido entre el nacimiento y la transición para convertirse en adulto. La situación de la infancia está determinada por la sociedad a la que pertenece el niño o la niña. Los contextos se modifican y también la relevancia social que tiene la población infantil en cada momento de la historia. Las guerras generan hambre, muerte, dolor propio y sobre los seres queridos, miedo, enfermedades, desplazamientos forzosos, falta de escolarización. Junto a la creación de conciencia sobre los niños como víctimas inocentes de los conflictos, coexiste la idea de que algunos de esos niños son los hijos de los enemigos y, por tanto, posibles responsables futuros de nuevos conflictos.
Empezamos a ver pues, niños disfrazados de soldado en las representaciones en los libros de texto. La cartilla escolar, insisto, es un ejemplo como muy explícito. Se contaba con ejemplos de balas. Todas las ilustraciones, todas las representaciones eran en clave bélica. Y eso, pues, en función de la zona donde se estuviera y cómo avanzase el conflicto, pues se imponían un modelo u otro, pero ya te digo que de una forma mucho más cruda y mucho más vinculada al lenguaje bélico que en los años anteriores.
Tenemos fotografías de niños desfilando por la Gran Vía de Madrid que llevan un fusil de madera al hombro y cantando la Internacional. Y al contrario, niños de la zona nacional levantando el puño y cantando también himnos fascistas. Eso se ha hecho en todas las épocas. E incluso tenemos manuales escolares. Los manuales escolares de la época te dicen mucho de cómo pensaban los políticos de esa época.
Tenemos representaciones, incluso alguna ilustración en la cual pues se ven niños luchando con soldados españoles o civiles españoles que pues eran ostensiblemente mucho más grandes que ellos, pero que tenían que luchar contra ellos porque ante todo estaba defender a su patria, sus ideas, incluso fuera de España.
Algunos libros que se titulan Libro de las Madres y pretendían pues dar unas nociones a las mismas para que educaran a sus hijos en los valores patrios. Es decir, empiezan más o menos diciendo ese bebé que tú tienes en los brazos pues puede terminar siendo un enemigo de la patria o un patriota y todo eso pues va a depender de ti.
Una de las cosas fundamentales es el castigo físico. Es una forma de reforzar la autoridad. Entre los valores que quería transmitir el franquismo estaba la disciplina, la autoridad, el respeto a la autoridad en general. Claro, los maestros son los primeros que transmiten esos valores.
Tras la Primera Guerra Mundial y la hambruna de Europa Central, comenzaron a proliferar imágenes que centraban la atención en el sufrimiento y la necesidad de los niños a través de campañas de gran éxito como las de Save the Children. La Guerra Civil Española reforzó el protagonismo de los niños como víctimas de las guerras y de las campañas propagandísticas tanto de organismos no gubernamentales como de las campañas organizadas por ambos contendientes. La imagen de los niños sufriendo se convirtió en un elemento principal de la imaginería humanitaria contemporánea a través de la cual quedó establecida la iconografía de la infancia basada en la inocencia. Finalizada la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el proceso de reconstrucción y rehabilitación, bajo el paraguas de la URJC, se concentró en facilitar ayuda a la población civil. el derramamiento de sangre de las guerras europeas convirtió a los niños en el principal objeto en el que proyectar la esperanza de toda Europa, por lo que se multiplicaron las miradas sobre la infancia, tanto en su defensa como en su reeducación en la posguerra. Se estableció un consenso por el cual deberían ser educados para convertirse en futuros ciudadanos responsables.
Durante las primeras décadas del siglo XX lo que vemos es una situación de extrema delicadeza y de vulnerabilidad de la infancia. Principalmente venía determinada por los altos índices de analfabetismo que existían en España y que venían determinados en parte por la falta de confianza o por la falta de creencia en la educación por parte de las familias, ¿no? Que no creían que la educación les fuera a facilitar o les fuera a proporcionar necesariamente un futuro profesional muy esperanzador.
En muchos casos no se incorporan a la escuela, a pesar de que el franquismo hace de la escuela un pilar de su labor de nacionalización de la población y adoctrinamiento político. En muchas ocasiones lo que priorizan es la vida, ¿no? La vida de su familia, el intentar ganar un sustento, y no solo hablamos de comunidades que pudieran ser marginales, como por ejemplo el pueblo gitano, sino de cualquier tipo de personas en aquellos momentos en áreas rurales.
Claro, esto da como resultado unos altos también índices de absentismo escolar. Esto es, las familias no llevan a sus hijos a la escuela y optan por llevarles a trabajar con ellos, sobre todo en las zonas más rurales, en las cuales pues, había que hacer recolección, vendimia o cualquier tipo de actividad, sobre todo del sector primario, en la cual pues, la mano de obra era más necesaria. Y bueno, pues esto vamos a ver cómo va a condicionar la vida de las escuelas, ¿no? Los calendarios escolares se modificaban en determinadas zonas, insisto, sobre todo en zonas rurales, en las cuales bueno, pues se planificaba el curso teniendo en cuenta pues, este tipo de actividades externas a la escuela, pero que influían en ella directamente.
La situación del país tras la guerra es devastadora, en el sentido de que se han perdido cosechas, se ha perdido fábricas, se ha perdido mucho capital humano, ya no solo las pérdidas humanas como tales, sino el capital humano en cuanto a las propias labores, ¿no?, que existen. Si nos vamos a la infancia es todavía peor. Han perdido en muchos casos a sus padres, también a sus madres, incluso familias enteras. Otros niños han salido del país, los niños de Rusia, que han sido llevados fuera de España en esos momentos. Pero sobre todo hablamos de esos niños de familias rurales, campesinas, que es los que quizás están menos estudiados, que son los más damnificados. Son niños que muchas veces han perdido la cabeza de familia y no tienen ni siquiera que comer. Dependen de sus madres, que tampoco están empleadas, y en una situación verdaderamente precaria.
Bueno, los niños, como señalaba antes, van a ser los grandes vulnerables de este conflicto, ¿no? En función del bando en el que estuviesen sus respectivas familias, si es que lo estaban, o la zona geográfica en la que se encontrasen, bueno, pues las vivencias van a ser distintas claramente, y también va a mediar su clase social u otras características. Pero digamos que van a vivir experiencias de desarraigo, bien porque van a tener pérdidas en su contexto más próximo, o bien porque van a tener que afrontar, bueno, pues momentos de despedida, por ejemplo las clausuras de las escuelas en determinados momentos.
Había más de 7.000, 8.000 niños que estaban abandonados, que no tenían escuela y que no tenían nada. Y entonces que se habían dedicado las escuelas para albergar a todos los voluntarios. ¿Por qué no se hacía eso con lo que era la casa del pueblo, con lo que eran instalaciones que tenían pues, para el ocio, que se cerrasen los salones de baile y se dedicasen a eso, y no a los niños? Pero el gobierno municipal de Albacete reconoce que era imposible dar a esos niños escuela. Pero no solamente eso, el hambre. El hambre, también hay otro documento, otra acta de lo que es la sesión municipal, del ayuntamiento, que dicen que se pasa mucha hambre, que los niños son los primeros que están sufriendo las consecuencias de eso.
Lógicamente, los hijos de las clases trabajadoras son los que más sufrieron el hambre y la miseria de estos años de posguerra, y lo hacían con un racionamiento insuficiente, lo hacían inventando recetas que nunca habían hecho, con escasísimos medios, así que los niños como mucho podían tener alguna semana al mes pues un poco de chocolate o un poco de leche condensada, o los niños y enfermos y mayores tenían una lata de leche condensada, siempre que pudieran comprarla. Había mucha gente, muchas familias que no podían. El racionamiento no solo afectó a la alimentación, sino también a la ropa y a la falta de medicinas. Muchas familias que llevaron a los niños a los comedores de auxilio social es porque los padres o estaban presos o habían huido, habían pasado la frontera y estaban en el exilio. Los abuelos no podían hacerse cargo de los niños, sobre todo si eran más de uno o más de dos. Y así que los tenían que poner en el escalón del comedor y ellos mismos entraban, se sentaban, cantaban sus canciones o himnos y luego pues comían y rezaban y por lo menos habían comido una vez. Y esa pues a veces era la única salida.
Hay un interés por parte del franquismo de que la esfera pública, por llamarla de algún modo en aquellos momentos, en la calle, se convierta en un lugar con cierto decoro, una moralidad más o menos afín a ese régimen nacional católico que se impone. Entonces los mendigos en general y la mendicidad infantil en particular se convierten en un escollo para ese régimen que intenta imponer la imagen de que no hay miseria en ningún sitio. Todo eso se oculta deliberadamente y de hecho los comedores de auxilio social están puestos en lugares estratégicos muchas veces para que la gente no los vea.
La escuela se establece como el centro de enseñanza, socialización y adoctrinamiento, pero también el punto a partir del cual mejorar cuestiones como la nutrición, la salud física y la higiene. Las instituciones tutelaron la infancia de los hijos de los presos políticos. La escuela, junto con las madres, se transformaron en las educadoras de la nueva moral.
Lo fundamental era el contexto de partida, ¿no? Y son esos índices de analfabetismo que especialmente en el caso de las mujeres eran mucho más elevados, no hay una diferencia significativa. La escolaridad al final se esperaba que quien podía prosperar en la vida fuesen los hombres y las mujeres pues, iban a estar en el hogar, no merecía la pena, por así decirlo, educarlas, ¿no? Las familias no sentían que eso fuese necesario.
Si pensamos, por ejemplo, en las familias en las que el padre ha desaparecido, su rol pasa a ser fundamental. Y no solo los niños mayores que tienen que hacer las funciones de padre, sino sobre todo cualquier tipo de niño. Los niños tienen que empezar a dedicarse a labores que no estaban hechas para la infancia, al campo, por ejemplo, ayudar a sus madres en aquellos momentos. En los casos de las familias represaliadas, muchas veces las mujeres se convierten en las que ganan el pan, en las ganapanes de la familia, y los niños son las que ayudan a las mujeres. Incluso pensemos, por ejemplo, en los robos. Ellas se dedican a robar porque no tienen otra cosa, los niños también roban. Las estadísticas lo que nos muestran es que los robos, los delitos de hurto aumentaron muchísimo en esta época y sus protagonistas muchas veces fueron jóvenes y niños.
La mayoría de las mujeres que tenían niños pequeños, digo de hasta 4 o 5 años más o menos, tuvieron a los niños en la cárcel con ellas. Concretamente en el caso de Málaga vemos que algunas tuvieron a nietos en la cárcel con ellas, porque otra familia no se podía hacer cargo de estos niños. Luego, a partir de esa edad, pues ya pasaban a un orfanato o pasaban a alguna institución del Estado o política, pero estaban normalmente en las cárceles con las madres. Es significativo porque la política del régimen franquista alardeaba de ser protector de la familia como institución y por otra parte pues las castigó por ser precisamente madres de familia, madres de republicanos o hijas de republicanos. En otros casos pues la familia tenía que llevar a los niños a los comedores de Falange, a los comedores de auxilio social y a las instituciones que fueran porque no podían sostenerlo, sobre todo en un contexto de posguerra en el que todo estaba racionado.
Había que distinguir lo que eran los hogares infantiles, que dependían básicamente de la Administración nacional y provincial, y luego de lo que era la casa de maternidad, que dependía de la Diputación provincial. La casa de maternidad y el hogar infantil ese que había, la casa de beneficencia, eran niños pobres, niños abandonados, niños que estaban en la máxima pobreza, y convivían esos niños pobres con gente discapacitada, con gente loca. Es decir, había ancianos que estaban, que no tenían equilibrio mental, que estaban andrajosos.
En la propia Constitución de 1931 se recoge la adhesión de la República a la Declaración de Ginebra, que años antes ya había establecido pues una especie de derechos de los niños, de la responsabilidad que tenían los adultos con los niños, y esa protección de la infancia yo creo que sensibilizó mucho más la acción educativa hacia la infancia.
Dentro de ese proceso de renacionalización, una parte fundamental es la reespañolización de hombres y mujeres, de manera muy diferenciada, porque el régimen considera que eso ha sido trastocado durante la Segunda República con ciertas leyes, como la ley del divorcio, el permiso el voto femenino, etcétera, y es el momento de que las mujeres retornen al hogar. Claro, ese modelo femenino de española, ¿no?, que se quiere inculcar, parte de la infancia. O sea, a las mujeres pues, se les enseña a bordar, a ser buenas madres, a coser, a cocinar, a todas esas cuestiones que persiguen un objetivo, que es convertirlas en un ángel del hogar, que esté siempre dentro de su casa, por supuesto, y que provea de niños y de niñas a la patria, porque al fin y al cabo la mujer va a ser luego la educadora de los niños, va a ser la que en los primeros momentos de la infancia eduque al niño antes de llegar a la escuela.
Se le explica a las madres cómo deben educar a esos niños, ¿no? Cómo debe ser la educación en el colegio, a qué tipo de colegios llevarlos, qué tipo de institutrices tener en la casa para ayudarles. A las niñas, sobre todo, pues no dejarlas salir mucho a la calle, los sitios de ocio para esos niños, pues que no fueran a los bailes, que fueran al cine con mucha precaución, que fueran sobre todo a actos religiosos.
Cuando eran, digamos, más pequeños, el ideal de la disciplina era fundamental, y más en la escuela donde el profesorado representaba una autoridad.
Claro, los maestros son los primeros que transmiten esos valores, y si no entra de manera pacífica, entra pues, con sangre. Entonces, en la época de los reglazos de madera y todos esos castigos completamente humillantes, completamente abusivos, es la época de los 40, los años 40 del siglo XX, la época de posguerra. Hay multitud de niños que sufrieron castigos humillantes como estar de pie con los libros, que le dieran golpes con la regla, que le dieran golpes de cinturón, y luego eso se prolongaba fuera de los muros de la escuela, porque el maestro, especialmente en áreas rurales, estaba presente en la vida del pueblo. Entonces iba el padre y le volvía a castigar, el maestro siempre estaba vigilante.
Una sociedad autoritaria, una escuela autoritaria. Y eso se hacía en todo. Por eso yo le digo siempre a los maestros ahora nuevos que los hechos del pasado no se pueden juzgar con la mentalidad actual. Eso era así. El castigo físico imperaba, porque imperaba también en el hogar. Así de claro.
Había represión hacia esos niños, o violencia hacia esos niños de una forma o de otra, más o menos directa. Recuerdo un testimonio al que yo entrevisté que en la propia escuela le dieron unos regalos por Navidad, y cuando llegó él, que era hijo de un preso republicano, dijeron: a este no le deis nada que es rojo. Esa humillación a un niño de 7 años, como era este hombre, en ese momento debía ser terrible y debió ser habitual en muchísimos espacios muy reducidos, sobre todo en pueblos donde todo el mundo sabía quién era quién, se conocían perfectamente, habían denunciado los unos a los otros. Entonces ahí la infancia debió ser verdaderamente dura para esos hijos de represaliados.
El escenario español se presentó a Europa como un teatro de ensayo también en el plano educativo. El objetivo en este periodo era adoctrinar a los niños en los principios por los que se luchaba y preservarles de las influencias del contrario.
La escuela siempre ha sido una herramienta útil para diseñar y para promover la nacionalización de las masas, ¿no?, de las nuevas generaciones de niños y niñas en España. Durante el primer tercio del siglo XX, digamos que conviven varios modelos de identidad nacional, uno más conservador, algún otro, podríamos decir, propiamente ya republicano, alguno de carácter más imperialista, pero concretamente durante la Segunda República conviven dos modelos. Un modelo conservador que viene, digamos, heredado ya de décadas anteriores, directamente podríamos decir de la época de Primo de Rivera, que concibe España como un país único, que es indivisible, que bueno, puede tener distintas sensibilidades culturales en otras regiones, pero que en ningún caso cuestionan la unidad nacional. con modelos o referentes históricos, pues los grandes personajes como los reyes católicos, Cristóbal Colón, Miguel de Cervantes, Felipe II, que digamos representan momentos gloriosos o momentos de expansión cultural y territorial de España. Y luego tenemos un modelo republicano propiamente ya de esta época, de la Segunda República, en el cual vemos que España es un país, podríamos decir, un poco más diverso, con otras sensibilidades culturales. Ya se empieza a ver, bueno, pues cómo aparecen ya esos estatutos de autonomía, en el caso de Cataluña y posteriormente del País Vasco, aunque este ya se aprueba un poco antes del estallido de la guerra, ¿no?
La Segunda República lo que hizo es que heredó todos los avances sociales en materia de infancia, protección a la infancia y la institución libre de enseñanza. La institución libre de enseñanza se crea en el último tercio del siglo XIX y entonces lo que hace es recoger las corrientes innovadoras que existen y de protección a la infancia, sobre todo del Reino Unido y de Francia. Y entonces se crean una serie de instituciones como podían ser, por ejemplo, las colonias escolares o las misiones pedagógicas. Las misiones pedagógicas lo que pretendía era incorporar las innovaciones que había en otros lugares a la escuela.
Pero sí que se empiezan a ver ya pues como esas sensibilidades culturales empiezan a florecer, los modelos y referentes históricos, bueno, siguen siendo un poco en ocasiones los mismos, pero también vemos ya referentes culturales, vemos ya cómo se amplía un poco el abanico de referentes para los niños y para las niñas. Entonces había que explicar qué era eso de una república, cómo podrían participar ellos en la república, qué derechos, qué libertades, qué obligaciones iban a tener dentro de ese proyecto, cómo había llegado también la república a España y en qué consistía, ¿no?
Y luego las colonias escolares lo que hacen es que para la Segunda República y la institución libre de enseñanza era básico cuidar de la salud y la higiene de los niños. Niños que vivían hacinados en viviendas de los suburbios de las grandes ciudades como Madrid, Barcelona y el País Vasco, que era donde empiezan las grandes industrias, pues estaban obligados a tener un montón de enfermedades. Lo que hace la Segunda República es que establece las colonias escolares en donde niños, por ejemplo, de las ciudades grandes como Madrid, como Barcelona, como Valencia, visitan por primera vez el campo, la montaña y sobre todo la playa. Porque iba dirigido no a los niños del campo, a los campesinos, porque esos niños estaban en contacto con la naturaleza y no necesitaban el sol, no necesitaban el aire libre.
Una parte importantísima para entender el franquismo es que es un proyecto de regeneración nacional en todos los sentidos. Todo lo que tiene que ver con la Segunda República se borra de un plumazo, absolutamente. Y en eso la infancia tenía mucha importancia. La infancia durante la República había accedido a la escuela, había adquirido una serie de valores cívicos que el franquismo considera que son equivocados y contrarios a lo que debe ser la identidad nacional española. Y en ese momento lo que hace el franquismo es intentar borrar todo eso. Para ello, pues, utiliza la escuela como uno de esos pilares. No es el único, desde luego, no es el único, pero la escuela es fundamental porque es la infancia que es mucho más moldeable, a la que puede inculcar una serie de valores diferentes y sobre todo porque considera que el maestro, que es la figura que debe ser la que transmite esos valores a los niños, es fundamental a nivel local.
El mejor ejemplo, una maestra, Palmira Buido Chapín. Fue maestra con la dictadura de Primo de Rivera, con la Segunda República, con el franquismo. Cuando la Segunda República implanta la coeducación, en el año 37, ella estaba de maestra en un pueblo que se llama Alpera, de Albacete, y ella llevaba un diario de clase. Dice, hoy, día tal, los niños y las niñas han estado jugando juntos en el patio de recreo. Es el primer día en donde han estado y se ha implantado la coeducación. Y ha sido una maravilla. Niños y niñas han disfrutado unos de otros. Se implantó, o sea, se experimentó un cambio tremendo, de ver que niños y niñas son iguales desde el nacimiento y que hay que educarlos en igualdad. Y eso fue muy básico. Desgraciadamente, cuando llega el franquismo, acaba con eso.
Hay una depuración del magisterio brutal, se eliminan, se encarcelan, se separan de sus trabajos a muchos maestros, porque son esos los que consideran que han descristianizado y han desnacionalizado, entre muchas comillas, a los niños, y ahora el objetivo es el contrario, el objetivo es que el maestro se convierta en el puntal de la recristianización y de la renacionalización de la juventud española y de la infancia española.
Aunque la Guerra Civil Española se suele inscribir como un conflicto doméstico, historiadores como Ángela Cenarro o Enzo Traverso señalan que la Guerra Civil trató de resolver por las armas un conflicto presente en todas las sociedades europeas. Esta realidad no solo fue vivida en España, sino que se percibía en el contexto europeo una agitación social que respondía a un enfrentamiento directo entre dos posturas contrarias de entender el mundo, la realidad y al hombre.
Tenemos el ejemplo de la Alemania nazi o la Italia fascista de Mussolini, que digamos que bueno, pues van a emplear recursos humanos y recursos económicos, esfuerzos económicos digamos elevados en participar para apoyar al bando sublevado, ¿no? Al bando franquista. Vamos a ver cómo precisamente, claro, ese esfuerzo económico y ese esfuerzo logístico que van a hacer, de alguna forma, entre comillas, diríamos que tenían que rentabilizarlo de alguna manera, ¿no? En forma de propaganda dentro de sus propios países. Vamos a ver que la Guerra Civil Española, por ejemplo, prácticamente desde al poco de empezar, empieza ya a ocupar páginas de libros de texto en Italia. Empezamos a ver ya cómo se empieza a hablar de la Guerra de España, de la guerra de España, contando bueno, pues los principales hitos, batallas en los cuales estaban participando los italianos directamente, ¿no?
La escuela fascista en Italia, por ejemplo, la escuela alemana, con diferentes salvedades y con la intensidad que hubo en el nazismo, que fue mucho mayor, también trataron de inculcar una visión completamente diferenciada del pasado nacional a los niños, trataron de nacionalizar, en buena medida lo consiguieron. Yo creo que en el caso del nazismo lo consiguió de una manera bastante exitosa respecto, por ejemplo, al franquismo. Entonces las similitudes eran muchísimas, entre otras cosas porque el franquismo no inventa nada nuevo.
Eran las políticas de siempre, eran el hacer cruz y raya sobre las políticas de la Segunda República, y se impone una nueva normativa y también una nueva cultura para las mujeres.
Las necesidades de seguridad, refugio, comida, educación y cuidados médicos dominan la discusión sobre las experiencias de los niños en conflictos y les posiciona como seres pasivos. Estas narrativas oscurecen y homogeneizan la complejidad de las vivencias de los niños en las guerras.
La memoria se ve relegada al olvido si no hay una representación de por medio. Entonces, al representar, entran en juego una serie de contradicciones, probablemente forman parte de lo humano, de la ambigüedad de lo humano, pero que hay que ser conscientes de ellas y hay que manejar.
You've seen that the documentary is a very interesting one. Probably you've got lots of questions, but please save them for the Q&A session. First, we're going to listen to Professor Alonso and Farré. First, Jesús Alonso. I'm going to briefly introduce him. He is a professor of civilization of contemporary Spain at the Université Bordeaux-Montaigne. He's the author of many publications that has to do with the victims of the war and political violence. Some of his works are 1937, Los niños vascos evacuados a Francia y Bélgica, 1936-1940. It was a pioneer book that dealt with a topic that had not been studied, and it was published in 1998. He is the author of Piedras y Acero, Monumentos a las Víctimas de la Guerra Civil y el Franquismo en Euskadi. And he is the author and co-editor, together with Jordi Guixé and Ricard Conesa, of the work 10 años de políticas de memoria, 2007-2017, and the work Trazos de Memoria, Trazos de Historia, published in 2021. and the collected book La Segunda República, el proyecto modernizador de una democracia reformista, 1931-1936, published last year. So, Jesús, you've got the floor.
So thank you very much for your presentation, and I would like to kindly thank you for having invited me. For me, it's always very interesting to be in Barcelona and to benchmark my work with that of you. As Matilde already mentioned, exile and war are the topics of my PhD research, which I started a while ago now. This is interesting for two reasons. One has been evoked by Laura before. My service, the service I carried out, were implemented back in the 90s. Today, this would have been impossible because many of the interviewees are long gone. Their experiences, their lived experiences would have been tailored in a different way. The way the memory around war and the Franco dictatorship has evolved, of course, would have had an impact in these testimonies. It doesn't mean that when I gathered these testimonies, they were unbiased, of course. This is not the case. It is always very emotional to go back to this topic. Even though it's been now a while, I am not working on it. But I'm particularly interested in live experiences, in children during war, and what war entails for many of them at the end of the day is the abandonment of the nation, exile, even if it was a temporary one, which of course entails a longer or shorter stay in foreign countries. For today's presentation, we knew that we would be screening the documentary, telling you or detailing all the circumstances. I don't want to focus on the tragic or dramatic dimension to the documentary, which I'm not denying. I'm going to give you figures that prove the contrary. As it has been said by Professor Eiroa previously, and it is clearly depicted in the documentary, well, children are oftentimes depicted as victims, subjects of history. In my stance, the service I carried out brought me to see them as players. Of course, they were not the main players in taking the decision to go in exile, but there's always circumstances that somehow push them up to becoming key players. And this is the topic I would like to focus on. And of course, I am going to try not to fall into any dramatization, and at the same time, I don't want to undermine the violence against children during war. Let me give you a figure. The war started on July the 18th, and 4 days after, there was a bombardment, a rather old-fashioned one, yet quite bloody, because in the Chambiano bombardment in July the 22nd, between 60 and 80 people died, half of them children. And as it has been said before, these bombings show that children were the first victims of war. They were, as Laura mentioned before, and it's made clear in the documentary, hunger, poverty, the separation from their parents, the disarray, etc. All these elements are central in children's experience during war periods, and at the same time, going to exile, spending a long period away from their relatives and their parents. Sometimes it took them months to regroup the families, so this uncertainty adds an extra layer of dramatism. And of course, I always, in the interviews, I could see a still very alive mental trauma Without undermining this dramatic reality, I would like to evoke today exile as an opportunity for discovery, a door towards a different reality, inaccessible from Spain. One needs to consider. I don't have a graphic presentation with figures, but more or less it would not be exaggerated to say that more than 100,000 children were forced to flee the country from 36 to 39. The figure is not far-fetched, and this, of course, speaks about the importance of this phenomena. In this panel on children's representations, my aim is to see to what extent, for many, and this was quite surprising to me, I thought children would have experienced exile in a very dramatic way, when in fact their narrative was rather a positive one. I believe the documentary shows it quite eloquently. For many of them, exile was some sort of island, a childhood island before going to exile. Many of them were locked at home, schools were closed, and in exile in the 2 or 3, 4 years that it lasted for many of them. For the rest, it would last the rest of their lives, right? Well, they somehow regained a certain dynamics, going back to school, being allowed to play, and coming back to Spain meant to them to face a quite dramatic reality during the post-war period. Perhaps we're not aware of what the post-war period entailed here in Spain, and in many occasions, many of these children had to grow up dramatically and perform adult dynamics. I would like to focus on other points also. Considering the previous idea, I mentioned the interviews and the service I carried out with these people are framed in the 90s, and this has to be highlighted. In many occasions, their experiences are interconnected with several criteria or phenomena that somehow shape the lived experience. Let me list a few, such as, for example, hosting experiences. Some people were hosted in colonies or in child communities or in refuges with adults, with grown-ups, and many of them in shelters, in temporary families. In the 39, many children were also sent to the concentration camps in France. So, of course, the type of or the way they were hosted is detrimental in shaping the experience as much as age is, because, of course, it's not the same to be 6 and to be 10 or 12. Many 10 or 12 years old toddlers had adult responsibilities. The major trauma I detected in many of the participants to the interviews was precisely being asked by the parents to take care of their younger siblings. So if they were in the same colony, it could be the case. But in some occasions, families would adopt one children but not another. So there was a first separation. Sometimes siblings were located in the same street, but I found a very extreme case. 3 brothers, 3 siblings that ended up in 3 different countries. Thankfully, this was not very frequent. Gender is also another axis that matters to understand the lived experiences. The lived experiences and the time in exile also shapes the perception of the lived experience amongst participants. In most cases, we're speaking about 2 to 3 years, but for many, it was a lifetime. In the case of Russian boys and girls, well, many of them tried to go back to Russia in the 50s, but then they had to flee back in exile, considering the situation here in Spain in the 50s. So all these factors have a direct impact in the lived experiences, as I was mentioning before. I would like to raise a couple of examples. I said I wouldn't be dramatic, and perhaps I am being a little bit dramatic. Let me be a little bit more constructive. I am sure you have read The Other Tree of Guernica by Luis de Castresana. This novel is an autobiography, in fact, and the author, through Santi, describes his experience in exile, and to a certain extent, while it had a lot of success and spread, and it was a way to share the experience of exiled children at the end of the Franco regime. It was published in 1967. A second piece that I would like to evoke, the title itself already speaks about resilience, which back in the 90s, the concept didn't exist. I mean, the idea did, but not the word. And the title is We Had to Learn How to Smile, The Exile of a War Child, published in 1995 by Javier Jabastizabal. This is clearly an autobiography. The author, born in 1929, evokes his exile in France until his return in 1943. In both cases, to a certain extent, one can grasp the idea of world discovery. And this is precisely what I wanted to share with you today. Understanding to what extent exile, the experience of exile, ended up shaping their potential vocation and life trajectories. Let me read a short fragment about how this exile was experienced as a new world. As I said before, it's an autobiographic novel. What Santi appreciated the most about the island was peace, and what he liked the least was the fact that he wasn't in Spain but in France. Not only did Santi miss his family, his brother, his town, and his friends, which he did, but also that in the few weeks that he had been abroad, he had broadened his geographical scope and also his emotional scope or compass. So this idea, based on feelings, on experiences that are brand new, is quite widespread in the interviewees, in the different testimonies I had access to. So it is also interesting the case of Valentin López, another author whom became an ophthalmologist. This is quite a random information. Let me read a quote from him. After traveling all night long, we reached the Brittany, a town called Quimper, and from there we were sent to a sea town similar to Santurce called Auvergne. And he says, it is curious to say that I got to know Auvergne before Santurce, because from my neighborhood in San Vicente, I was always stuck in my neighborhood in San Vicente. In other words, he visited Auvergne before than Santurce, which is 5 kilometers away from his home in Spain. So this idea of broadening one's span is quite recurrent in many of the experiences shared by these toddlers. Let me read my notes. The phone is... There is a very profound nostalgia towards their place of origin, their friends, their relatives, and age plays a key role. 5, 6, 7, 8 years old children can integrate quickly, and they tend to perhaps not forget, but leave aside this previous life, whereas older children, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, perhaps have more barriers in deleting the past experiences, so they live it in a much more dramatic way. There is another element which matters, attitude or respect, not only towards others, but towards nature, animals. These are ideas that have a deep impact in minors. One of the interviewees remembered how once they found a dead bird and the caregiver would bury her and do a short funeral to the bird. And the interviewee told me, well, in fact, we killed the birds. They were our targets, so respect towards others, respect towards wildlife was in sharp contrast with the lived experience during the first months of the war. So these new values, these new attitudes, this new way of coexisting are quite remarkable. Ideas such as laicity, secularism, or the fact that any political idea is hidden in comparison with the case in Spain during that convulsed period. Then there is also another element that I would like to point to your attention. Oh, the text I want to read is rather long, and this is why I want to have enough time to do so. But in both cases, the examples I want to evoke are foundational experiences. In the case of Javier Salastizábal, there are two remarkable elements to him. One being the access to comic, which was impossible in Spain, and access to cinema. I'm not saying children didn't go to the cinema back then in Spain, but it was more limited. Access to cinema was rather limited. If I recall correctly, in Salastizábal's work, the author refers to more than 250 films seen during exile in France. It's not the case of the majority of these toddlers, of course, but it's quite remarkable. Let me read a quote here. He says, I'm going to skip the comic part. Perhaps this practice seems minor if looked from outside, but for me it's much more than a mere memory lost amongst the many events that unfold those years. The way of feeling available took over me. This does not belong to things that can be explained easily. It rather corresponds to more personal and inner impulses, and as such, less transferable. Looking at things differently, everything I am today and everything I will be in the future was already popping up back then in this remarkable Biarritz-Anglet-Bayonne train station, and I still have this perseverance and this insistence of knowing how to leverage on the minor things in life as if they were abandoned. I don't want to be an example to anyone, but Lord praise those who consider that they have to apologize for such things. There's another quote that I am not going to read, in which he insists in the idea of cinema as a source of salvation. He became one of the best cinema critics in the Basque country. He also wrote scripts himself and a biography, a Gardel biography. So it is clear that this early experience was detrimental. In the case of Luis de Castrasana, and I'm concluding, is quite remarkable today. He's not a very well-known author, but back in the 70s and in the 80s, he was one of the main Basque writers, and his work was widely recognized. Let me quote him. The Other Tree of Guernica became a bestseller. It's been edited more than 30 times and translated into many languages. Let me quote him. It rained permanently for a few days, and the landscape became melancholic. Santi sat in the living room with the firehouse on, and he read for hours. He had never liked books that much, but more and more it became impossible for him to skip them. They were like faithful and silent friends, waiting to be open to speak about marvelous things. He spoke about El Quijote, which he had never found interesting, nor to speak about Cervantes, because, of course, perhaps the teacher here in Spain would be too positive about Cervantes. This is my last quote, I promise. El Quijote seems alive, fresh, juicy. The book is full of illustrations representing the windmills, Sancho with Rocinante. The discovery of the pleasure of reading unleashed Santi. Books were to him, from that day on, as a pleasant adventure, a better one than walking down the beach on the dunes, looking for the remainings of a ship sinking. This is a very poor translation of the quote, my apologies. And this is another fragment I would like to read. Santi thought that how beautiful would it be to write, to look at the sea and express one's feelings, one's visions and thoughts, getting rid of arguments and men and women from one's head and putting them on paper and build a book to be read by others, to have fun, to cry or to smile while reading. Santi told himself that this was much better than being a pelotari, a plane pilot, a doctor, or any other cool profession. So this is a very clear example to what extent the experience marked him. And as I said before, he was an excellent writer, and he was not the only one who had these groundbreaking experiences in exile, in partially thanks to the circumstances, in exile. And I'm going to leave it here. Thank you.
Muy bien, gracias.
Thank you.
Bueno, después tendremos la oportunidad.
We'll have the opportunity to ask, or maybe I got a paper saying that I had to finish in 2 minutes, so I apologize for the ending of my presentation. Let's move to Professor Sébastien Farré, Executive Director of the House of History and co-director of the festival Histoire et Cité. He's been working on humanitarian aid, the world wars, the contemporary Spain, and immigration to Switzerland. And related to the topic today, I would like to mention his publication, International Childhood Center, 1949-1997, From Archive to History. And this year he's published International Committee of the Red Cross and the Killings of Paracuellos del Jarama. So we'll give the floor to Professor Farré. It's a big pleasure to be able to be with you today and give my presentation. And congratulations for the documentary we've just seen and the curators of the exhibition that we can see outside the room. I was thinking of doing something, but when I saw the virtual exhibition that you can also see online, I was thinking of doing something a little bit different and to engage a dialogue with the material of the exhibition, because I thought it was very interesting and maybe it would be something more dynamic for this round table. Something that struck me was the variety of the material. We can see photographies about context, spaces. The sources are also very different, and I think that's very interesting. I was thinking while I was listening to Jesús, maybe we started working with the children of the war, and now we're talking about childhood in wars and in the Second World War, and it's this change of paradigm that is part of an attempt to rewrite the Spanish Civil War and put in line with the history of European populations. And it's something that allows us to reflect, compare, and establish interesting links. I'm going to talk from the perspective of the humanitarian institutions, because I think it's a way of engaging, starting the dialogue I was mentioning at the beginning of my presentation. I've been used several photographs that are part of the exhibition, and I'm apologizing to the curators because I haven't asked permission to do that. So I'm gonna use some of the photographs of the exhibition to start this dialogue, this conversation. I would like to stress out the difficulty to know well humanitarian organization, because sometimes there is a certain degree of confusion between the White Cross, the Red Cross, these organizations that have long acronyms, and sometimes they share common values and they think that they are all humanitarian organizations. But we have to be careful and stress that there is a wide variety of organizations that have different purposes and different ways of functioning. This is why in the first part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about the different institutions, organizations that are part of the exhibition. First, I'm going to show you this chronology to point out that the First and the Second World War and the Spanish Civil War are fundamental laboratories to understand how it works. War and humanitarian institutions are closely linked. The vast majority of these organizations started working, functioning as organizations or institutions during wartime. So war and humanitarianism go hand in hand. It's something that you cannot separate. And here on the screen, you can see organization, Save the Children Fund, created in 1919, the UNRRI in 43, or UNICEF. I'm going to talk about Oxfam as well, and other institutions that I'm going to present or talk about them a little bit. We can distinguish several families of humanitarian organizations. Maybe the first that we can distinguish the most is the Red Cross movement. But within this movement of the Red Cross, we have very different organizations. The first one is the International Committee of the Red Cross International Committee, and the Federation of Societies of the Red Cross that unites all national societies belonging to the Red Cross that were at the beginning closely linked with national armies and providing health care to the armies. And there is the Commission Mixte, which is a platform that united the International Committee and the Federation of the Red Cross Societies during the Second World War. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to know the relationship between them, and we have to know very well what organizations we're talking about. The second group is what I've called the international institutions. These are institutions or organizations linked to the Society of Nations or the United Nations, or with projects that want to gather national associations and bring them at the international level. I'm going to talk about the Union Internationale de Secours aux Enfants, like the international platform of Save the Children Fund. The third group that I wanted to mention are the organizations which are national or ethnic, that play an important role. And here you can see some of these institutions. They are either British or American. Greek War Relief is a very important American organization set up during the Second World War to gather the donations of Greek population in the US in order to support Greek population during the Second World War that were the victims of starvation that caused more than 1 million deaths. The religion was important too. Here we have examples of religious institution, Caritas, the Quakers, John, which is an important American institution, Jewish institution who play an important role during the Second World War. Sometimes some of these organizations work together, some of these organizations transformed Save the Children Fund, created an international platform, and within this international platform we find national actors. So the humanitarian sphere and how to study it, to identify who is who and what they do, is a work that can be sometimes challenging, but it's important to do it. I could have talked as well about the institutions close to the workers' movement, particularly during the period between the wars, organizations close to the Communist Party that play an important role, like Centrale Sanitaire, Secours Populaire in France, that played, as I said, an important role. All these organizations, despite the fact of having different profiles, they will all have, after or since the First World War, and the children as their main focus. We've seen in the documentary many images from the end of the First World War, and children become like the prototype of victims and key image for this humanitarian propaganda. And for me, there are three reasons for that. Childhood or children are innocent victims. It's something that comes up and up in the documentary. And this allows the mobilization of a big proportion of the population. But it needs also a support of the governments and the institutions. And the neutrality of children. Children are not fighters. And the child will become a humanitarian agent because some activities can be carried out in enemy territories for subjects that are not connected to the war experience. Save the Children, for instance, starts in Germany and Austria, working at a moment where there was still a blockade in place by the winners, but the fact of helping the children and not the rest of the population help mobilize other countries, particularly the UK. And it's something also important for countries with neutral policies. So helping children is easier than helping the general population. And the third important element for me is that the children or the child represents an investment for the future since the 19th century. Helping the children is investing in the future. So investing in a society hardly hit by the war, well, the best investment in order to rebuild Europe, democracy, or bourgeois democracies, the best way to do it is investing in children. At the end of the 19th century, when reforms and hygienic policies were implemented in poor neighborhood, trying to save children from poverty and the dangers of these areas. Well, after the First World War, there will be an attempt to save the children that live in the countries that have lost the war. Save the children is save Europe from communism. This image of European children celebrating the help coming from the United States is an image of a big American organization, and the logo seems to be connected to the Bolshevik Revolution. So the idea is to save these children that live in terrible conditions. So it's to save the body, but also to prepare socially these children that they will have an emotional link and they will be grateful to the United States for the help. The vast majority of organizations are British, Western, or American. And this is because in order to provide humanitarian aid, you need resources, and these are the countries that have enough food to export it to other countries. It is needed also to have means of transportation. This image is a good illustration. You need resources, material resources, and a presence in these countries. So the humanitarian aid is carried out in countries where there is an international presence, and it's done by countries that have important resources and that can help the countries that have lost the war. And here, the United States become the operational center of this humanitarian aid. These organizations share an ideological background, and they have also common mechanisms, such as the hygienist movement of the 19th century. First, they take children to colonies, to protected spaces where children can go back to a certain normality, can go back to school, and be protected. These mechanisms can be found in many countries. In the UK, they send the children from London to the countryside to protect them from the dangers of war. And the Madrid, and during the Spanish Civil War, that children were evacuated from Madrid. Switzerland received 40,000 French children during the Second World War in colonies for 3 months, so they can enjoy some calm and get better nourished. It's a mechanism that is used by many organizations. In the documentary, you have many images from Auxilio Social, the help, the Francoist help, but it's the same image that we can find in Republican institutions or in Save the Children. This is an image that you can see in the screen. It's from Saratov, the east part of Ukraine, where there were places where children can eat. And we can see this image that says we should help children by giving them a little bit of bread and a glass of milk. And this glass of milk is essential because it feeds the humanitarian imaginary in which milk is considered as a pure white drink that connects with the religious imaginary. And also connected with the hygienist doctors that said that milk would prevent people from drinking alcohol. That developed and got to different populations in post-colonial also spaces in Africa, and it was very hard for population to digest lactose. However, this idea of drinking milk continues, supported by the multinationals like Nestlé and others. So there was this post-colonial empires, and this humanitarian aid could be represented with this glass of milk or a carton of milk. So that connects a history of humanitarianism with a political, diplomatic, and economic history. Helping children is helping and saving children from communism, like in the image during the Civil War. The humanitarian aid were spaces where neutral powers could show solidarity with the Republic, but when cities were liberated by the glorious National Army, we will see that the distribution of milk created a new link with the new project of the government and the need to look after these poor children that they got lost by the perverse education of the Republican project. And in conclusion, I would like to say that it's very important, and we have in mind all these memorial initiatives that remind us all these actions, particularly in the framework of a war. And we can connect this story with the story of representations that, as we've seen in the documentary, with the history of education and the history of humanitarianism. We've seen that there was also a diplomatic effort, and humanitarianism was something used by governments, by the countries that won the war, and that helps us describe this transnational history. And I hope that this topic will be studied deeply in the future. Thank you.
So would you like... Oh, thank you very much. It's been a very thought-provoking and interesting and inspiring panel, the documentary, the presentations, and I am sure there will be interesting questions. The floor is yours, people. I believe the documentary has shed light on the situation of children during the war period and the post-war period. Laura also clearly depicted interesting technical elements that have to do with a reflection about the representation of childhood. She spoke about how to select dramatic images, considering that we're speaking about minors, and I ask myself, I'm going to hand it over to you right away, but I ask myself is, if in one of these post-war images, if in any of these post-war images, with these very fresh, clean children eating in canteens, would it not somehow enable the contrary reaction, some sort of banalization of the tragedy? This is just food for thought. We can discuss it. Professor Alonso also spoke about the different layers of children, the well-known position of the children as a victim, or another scope which would be reading children as key players who have new opportunities in their host families, and perhaps they can leverage on such new circumstances, and they can take profit of it, right, of exile, adapting to new cultures, getting to know new environments, new traditions, new everyday life, routines. Of course, I know you refer to the period after the Second World War, because even during the Second World War, well, you will tell us more about it. This is how I understood your remarks. These children that flee to Mexico and those who stayed in Europe in the Second World War. Europe probably went through similar circumstances as the ones experienced during the Civil War in Spain. And this brings me to raising a question on the tension between the Republicans in exile and the Republicans who stayed. It might look like those in exile lived in abundance, and well, perhaps we can talk about it. And last, I believe that Farré's presentation has been enlightening in the sense that you've come up with a classification of the different humanitarian institutions with different origins, different mandates. And as you rightly mentioned, they had like a common ground, which is humanitarianism and their, let's say, interest in childhood. So institutions do not live in a vacuum. They make sense in the context where they are developed. You've also referred to the different actions implemented by institutions to protect children, such as child canteens and others. And you've drawn parallels between the different images you mentioned, children in canteens, in European canteens, and children in the Falange canteens and other Spanish social aid institutions. For sure, the canteens in Spain had a different mandate, which was educating these children, raising these children in the ideology of the state, right? And this has been shown in the documentary. Some of these children, when they were separated from their mothers who were in jail, were sent to canteens and many times adopted by Franco partisan families. And this is where the history of children theft style starts. Well, the topic is wide. The floor is yours, people, and perhaps we want to raise questions, clarify doubts. The experts are in the table, so the floor is yours. Hello, I would like to ask you, considering that the topic is very timely and very contemporary, could you perhaps deepen on what your thoughts are in the following topic? To what extent aid policies have evolved? Many of these aid policies or patterns started in the First War or in the Second World War, and many of humanitarian institutions born back then are still operative today. But I don't know if you've observed any specific change, because unfortunately the problem is that we are still in a world where many children suffer still today and experience similar circumstances. So from my side, my area of expertise and communication regarding childhood, I believe there's been a critical review of the very colonial approach of humanitarian aid. Oftentimes, those in charge of humanitarian aid were white, Aryan, and the beneficiaries of humanitarian aid after the European conflicts ended, and I'm referring here to more recent campaigns promoted by Spain. Well, the beneficiaries are black or racialized black people. So there are even organizations who've carried out a critical review, such as Doctors Without Borders. They say, well, in the advertisement, it's always us, right, the white ones, whereas those in the field are, in fact, the victims, the racialized people. Not all organizations operate in the same fashion. We all still have in mind the pictures of these skinny African boys and girls. And of course, there are some organizations that have started, presenting themselves differently, or the way they present the victims, or the way they present the subjects. They don't speak about victims anymore. They speak about subjects or beneficiaries of humanitarian aid. I believe that, well, some attempts have been made to go forward. I cannot answer to your question in a thorough way, but I've seen more awareness, much more awareness. Your remarks made me think about a painting that I once saw referring to the refugees from Syria, and in the same painting, the same wall painting, you can see women fleeing from Guipúzcoa when the fascists were pushing them up to Vizcaya, and in the upper part of the painting there is a reference to Syrian refugees arriving to the Basque Country. So this is a way to say, listen, today it was us, it's them, yesterday it was us. So yeah, I believe that from this sense, it is a way to say, listen, we've been there. I believe this is very much related to the war experience. But at the end of the day, it is a community-based space, normalized, the regard of the institutions. Well, many of these institutions were built during the First World War in the context of reformist strategies with religious pacifist movements, whereas today there are even masters in international cooperation on humanitarian aid, so there are professionals in the field. This is more recent, perhaps it started back in the 80s or in the 90s, and relevant institutions, they all have like permanent delegations ready to jump to the field whenever it's necessary. So in this case, or in the past, it was like a quite personal initiative, people putting together financing and humanitarian aid resources like the ones we've seen in the picture. Well, in the past, it was different than today, right? And let's say, the impact of the destruction in world wars, it was tremendous, and it was impossible to counterbalance the situation, whereas today the Red Cross and other international players have a quite strong capacity of action in the field. The media, the means of transport has also evolved dramatically compared to the circumstances in the First and Second Wars. So at the end of the day, things, I mean, you know, in terms of values, in terms of this link between the liberal society and humanitarian aid, the logics, the dynamics are pretty similar. Nothing has changed much. I have a question for the three of you on the debate that has been clearly depicted and is very timely, the use of certain images, be it in a documentary, in a presentation, or in an exhibition. So let me go one step beyond representation. It is obvious that representation might lead to the naturalization of certain canons or reproducing stigma. But on the other hand, it's all about understanding how we select the images we use, in the sense that there is this debate that went on during the 70s about Holocaust survivors, why they were all like, you know, so skinny and famished. Beyond that, and especially when we call on childhood, consent matters, and I believe this to be central. We are much more aware of, well, there's this famous image, right? The war in Afghanistan, the green eyes girl. The girl never knew about the picture, and the author was a millionaire, right? No one helped her, in fact, and the girl expressed a few years after that the picture somehow had very important impacts on in the exhibition. Some pictures were pixeled, because what is the impact of such images in the socialization of victims, even more so when we add the racialization element? I believe that at the end of the day, unless we open an ethical debate on the topic, it's normal that what is happening today happens, right? Perhaps NGOs are much more aware, but it's normal that some people travel to countries abroad to take pictures with children and they upload them in social media, when in fact it would be impossible for them to do it here. Today, journalists who take pictures take consent into account, but what about with the legacy, with the historical legacy, with the archives? When we use such pictures, should we pixel them? Should we randomize them? It's a topic of great concern. For me, it's a topic of great concern, and I would like to know your opinion on how to tackle this element. Well, this is an extremely complicated topic. I hope I had the answer. I believe this is one of the in a world with no mobile phones, in a world with no new IT and communication mechanisms, it was difficult to raise awareness at the large scales in order to put together funds to promote humanitarian aid actions. I can imagine it hasn't been an easy task. You had to use the media, the journals. When Doctors Without Borders started advertising in journals, they still used they still published engravings. So there is a lack of awareness, right? Of course, the sons of the enemy, if I'm not mistaken, Eglantine ended up in jail as a result of these humanitarian campaigns, because they were somehow campaigning in favor of the enemy. Back then, in that context, I believe that without having the, let's say, image legacy we have today, what they aimed at was to show horror, and they did it. The recordings are just horrific, extremely heartbreaking. Then there's ARA, an American organization and some clips they recorded are the bomb, because the advertisement policy promoted by or adopted by Hoover organization is perhaps more related to saving children from the Bolsheviks. And in the images, they even throw corn to the floor so that children can grab it. They ask them to pay tribute to the good Americans, to thank them. They even shake their hands, their thin hands, to thank the Americans watching the film. What should we do with this archive? My position is images speak about the past, why humanitarian organizations were set up. I do not want to demon these organizations, but at the same time, we should have a critical stance about what they did. What they did. The images were horrific, but the end was legitimate, probably for the Americans. Ara's objectives were also legit, but we need to be critical. We need to, Susan Sarandon used to say it, keep showing horror images perhaps undermines our awareness as human beings. I believe there is no need to recur to certain images, but when we recorded the clip, for example, we had the doubt on whether to include certain images or not. There's only one image from Save the Children we used to somehow draw the parallel with the present. I believe they don't help, they don't contribute to building up the narrative we want to promote. More than an answer, I would like to share a few remarks or thoughts. I follow Susan Sontag also. I don't know if you remember the volume you published in which we Susan Sontag said that horror and disgrace are more easily accepted if it happens abroad. Whereas in fact, we never found images about children in the Civil War, whereas the Casas Viejas killing is there. We all know the picture and the bodies are there. Or the famine in the Ukraine. Even Otto Dick's pictures, quite strong ones. But you know, there is a clear lack of images evoking conflict in this environment. Now going back to the book, and one of the elements I'm most proud of is having managed to, well, you made me think about it. The majority of the pictures in the book belong to the children. They had been taken by them in their places of residence, in the colonies. There's one that I hold very dear about a brother and a sister who take a picture of themselves the day before departing to exile, and their faces express a deep sadness. After 1 year or two in France, they take a picture again, and they are smiley. Their face has transformed radically. Sometimes it's useful, you know, even if it's them who did provide these pictures. As you said before, some of these pictures have been thrown to the internet out of context. This is also true. And today, with artificial intelligence, there is a sort of invasion of images, invasion which are systematically manipulated, which makes it difficult to know what is, let's say, real and what is not. Do you know what's interesting is how our social sensitivity has evolved and to what extent our images, or these images have somehow, our relationship towards images has evolved. The images you mentioned before were sold sometimes as a postcard. Can you imagine going to a conference and distributing postcards of poor boys and girls? It looks unacceptable today. It is not possible today that the Western international organization uses these images from the 60s or the 70s where you can see African children, famined children, naked. Today this would be unimaginable. It is important to understand why we have changed our relationship with images and with this context. Of course, then, if you curate an exhibition, that's another context, right? And I believe this is why it's your work and the historians to act as mediators between our collective sensitivity, historic materials, in order to try and open a debate about these two extremes, or between these two extremes. It is not so much related to the previous point, but it popped to my mind the picture, Kappa's picture of the Vallecas house, the fact that the picture was taken by Kappa. Well, I don't know if the house has been preserved, but there was this idea, right? And it's actually Kappa's picture, which gives it this, let's say, power or significance. Is there any other question from the room? Oh, there's another one. Hello and good afternoon. Thanks. The discussion has been very interesting, and it made me think about the image that is oftentimes depicted about shelters or child colonies or civilians' shelters. You know, when we look at things from the eyes of the Republican propaganda, things are looked from one way, but if we look at things from the eyes of a photojournalist or an amateur photographer from the civilian population, the regard would be very different. My remark has to do with the following. Even if there are humanitarian aid initiatives during the First World War, of course, and then different episodes of international humanitarian aid during the 20s, but it is true that the Spanish Civil War is the first, or amongst the first, modern wars in which the bombings against civilians provoked important internal movements. Perhaps it's not remembered that here in Catalonia, in a population of 3 million inhabitants, 1 million people had to flee in 3 years, in a period of 3 years. So it is clear that some humanitarian aid initiatives had external intervention. The Civil War was some sort of guinea pig for the deployment of larger scale humanitarian operations. Shelters, colonies have existed for a long time, even before the Civil War. But there is no doubt that these shelters, these kind of shelters, were somehow replicated in other contexts. Has this been studied? Is there any research on to what extent the Civil War became some sort of school on humanitarian aid? Thank you. Yes, it has been studied, and I don't have an answer, to be honest. For me, the Civil War plays a role in the history of humanitarian interventions, and it has been considered as a starting point of many different elements, such as anti-fascism movements, amongst others, and this is still very present in the historiography. Humanitarianism, especially in humanitarian historiography, And we have to underline here suicide, for example, that, Deble Maria or other institutions that started taking care of children and somehow acting on the grounds of solidarity. But as in many fields in life, many of these initiatives were already there in the First World War. Francesca Wilson, for example, started her operations during the First World War, distributing milk, the same she did during the Civil War. So these models, these approaches started at the end of the 19th century in very different environments. Trade unions, colonies also somehow evolved to becoming leisure environments. The Communist Party invested a lot in colonies because it was the right time to set up a form of cooperation between the European elites and the Soviet Union to recognize the Soviet lap through social and leisure activities. I believe the question is remarkably interesting. Nonetheless, from my perspective, well, I have a little bit of a different perspective for me. The Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, many things stopped from the moment the First World War started. Anti-fascism became a very difficult field from the moment there was an agreement with the Soviet Union. Many institutions didn't survive. The Popular Front deployment, which was central in the configuration of the Republican movement in Catalonia and in Spain during the Civil War. So all these initiatives, Suicide was absorbed by the Red Cross, and Switzerland was it's horrible, right, for those who worked for them. They were like all of a sudden they became the armed arm of the Swiss army, and this happened in many contexts, like in the US. I don't have the final answer, of course. Amazing, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for your interest, for the questions. Thank you very much to the speakers for your presentations and for the clarifications. We're going to wrap up and we're going to move to the next panel at past.